I once dedicated 6 months of my life to moving 300 million rows of data from one database to another database. And a row of data, if you don't know anything about databases, might be something like when you fill out a form and put in your name and your address and your contact information, that might be like all one row of data. And we had to move from one system to another, and I spent just weeks and weeks of sitting in my cube, my little tiny contractor cubicle. I could reach out and touch all the sides of it from my chair. All of that just so I could move that data. And one day I was working on the programs to do that, and I heard this little thin knock on metal because cubicle walls have a little metal edge. And I turned around, and the guy that was standing there was not anybody I'd seen before. And I wasn't expecting anyone. And he introduced himself as the auditor. Our project was being audited, and I now had to explain to him all of what I was doing to move this data from the one database to the other. And as we worked through this process, he had lots of questions, some of which were fine, but it became very clear to me that he had no idea how this stuff worked. And when it came most clear was when he asked me if I had looked at every single piece of data to make sure they were right. And when you think of 300 million, and then each one of those rows has lots of pieces to it, literally impossible. But he asked me, and he said, well, why not? And so we had to have a long conversation, and I found myself getting very frustrated by this person whose job was to audit and check my work, to ask questions, to inspect it, and to come back with some kind of report about it. And I felt like this was unfair because he didn't really understand what it was that I was doing. And if you think about all the times in your lives that you are audited or inspected for something, it might be a building inspectors come to check your work on your house. It might be that you actually get audited at work by the finance people or whoever it is that do those things. Even when you go take your driver's test, they're auditing you, they're inspecting you to make sure you can still see and you can still do all of the things you need to do to drive. And those relationships tend to not be real comfortable ones because their job is to find stuff that's wrong and lift that up and make sure that everything is the way it is supposed to be. So when Jesus encounters these Pharisees and scribes, they sound a lot like inspectors. They're saying, oh, we've washed your hands and you did not wash them. You and your disciples are eating in this way, and that is against the traditions of the elders. You can imagine them with their clipboard and all of the traditions, checking on Jesus to make sure that they're all in line, and they're not, so they lift up their inspection report that says, you have failed. Now, as Jesus responds to them, so often when we are being inspected, we want to argue or debate our case. Instead, Jesus flips it around on them and says, listen, it's not what goes in that defiles, but what comes out. Now, the word here for defile is an important one, as is sort of the identity of the Pharisees. We tend to, I think, be pretty hard on the Pharisees because of Bible texts like this one, where Jesus calls them all hypocrites, and we go, oh yeah, those Pharisees, they were not good. And then you get to the part where Jesus gets crucified, and we know that the Pharisees and the religious leaders did that, so we think of them as the bad guys. But I have come to understand that the Pharisees were the people in their day who took all of these traditions and then tried to apply them in their present-day context. They took all of the traditions of faith that have been handed down for generations and tried to make them make sense in their present day. And if I think about the Pharisees in that way, they're probably not a whole lot different than us. Like if we could time travel back and hang out with them, we might find out that the Pharisees were the same kind of people that we are, just trying each day to live the best they can, given the religious traditions that have been handed down to them. So Jesus tells these people that are trying to be faithful that what goes in doesn't defile, but what comes out. Now the word defile here in Greek is this word koinao, and it means technically to make common. Now if you remember the people of Israel in the Old Testament, they're set aside by God to be this holy, and holy means set apart. They were set apart to be this holy and priestly people. Now, to be set apart is to not be common. And so this word that is translated defile, koinao, means to make common. So to no longer be set apart. So these inspectors that are standing there having this criticism of Jesus are saying, you all are doing things that make you common. You are going against this set-apartness, this holiness that we have, and you are becoming like common people. And if you understand it that way, it's a lot less about dirtiness than it is about sort of an understanding of how a whole group of people is different than another. And then you can start to see how we can be just like those Pharisees in the way that we judge one another, especially in hierarchical, like I'm better than you kind of ways. And just think about all of the times in our culture that you may look at someone and think, gosh, I'm sure glad I don't parent like they do. They need to get their parenting act together. Or we may look at someone's dress and say, oh, they walked out of the house in that. The other word we use a lot is just. We'll look at someone and say, oh, they're just, and then fill in the blank. And that just may be different for different ones of us. And in our culture, it doesn't just go like from what we would think as uncommon down to common, but it goes in the other direction. I had a wonderful summer job when I was in high school and college working in baseball fields with a bunch of blue-collar guys that worked there all the time. And the worst thing that ever happened in a week is if the people from the community center came out to tell us how to do our jobs. And we were like, you're just a bunch of office people. You don't know. Just because you studied recreation management doesn't mean you know how to take care of a baseball field, right? And so we get into these places where we judge and we apply labels and we look at others and we inspect their behaviors and we think they're not great. But it also can get a little bit deeper than that. This word koinao means to make common, but it comes from a whole family of words that all share most of their letters. There's a word called koinos that means to share in common. You think about, like, we share roads in common, we share marketplaces in common, we share identity as Americans or Floridians or Lutherans in common. Those are all things we share in common. There's another word, koinon, which just means to share something with someone. And then from that you can get to koinonia, which is a word for fellowship and communion. It is the word that is often used to describe the table that we share, that it is a fellowship they have with Jesus at this meal. It is also, at the beginning of worship today, Nicole stood up and said, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the koinonia, right? This communion that we share. So when Jesus uses this very particular word to say, you have made this common, it's also a word that is deeply tied to community. And so when you think of the ways and the list of things he gives that comes out of us, he talks about theft and murder and adultery and slander and envy. All of these things are harmful to community in some way, shape, or form. Right? If I steal from you, that breaks that bond of relationship that we might have. If I murder someone or if there's violence that is done, it starts to whack at and break down bits of our community. If we spread gossip or tell lies or even just ignore people or treat them as if they're somehow less than everybody else, all of that is harmful to community. So what Jesus seems to be saying is, what comes into your mouth and all that does not detract from community. It does not make you less than common, but what can do that is what comes out. Because what comes out of you can do exactly that. You can do great harm with what you say and how you act, not just to individuals, but to whole of the community. So when you then think about Jesus himself, at Christmas we talk about Jesus becoming a human being, right? So Jesus is the Son of God. He is divine. He is set apart. And yet to become a human means he became common, does it not? So out of that divinity, he became common among us. He left his set apartness to be part of who we are. And then when Jesus gets to the cross, we talk about his death, and which was really kind of uncommon in the way he died. But when the first century theologians talked about Jesus, and in the New Testament you read this, it says that we share in Jesus' death, not because we're really good at that, but because he came and shared our death with us. But then because we share in his death, we also share in his life, in the resurrection that followed. So Jesus, in a way, becomes common, so that we no longer have to be common. Right? Old Testament people were set apart to be God's holy people, but there was a reason for that. It was so that they could bless everyone else. Abraham and Sarah were told, you go be a blessing to others. You are blessed to be a blessing. So what Jesus does is make himself common so that we all can be lifted up into God's grace, which is what the resurrection is all about. Because he makes himself common, then no one is less than holy. So when Jesus says there's nothing that goes in that can defile you, what he's really saying is no one can tell you, no one can do anything to you that makes you less than a beloved child of God. You can get called names, you can have experiences that scar you forever, you can have family fights, you can have all kinds of stuff happen. And none of that comes in at you changes who you are in God's eyes. Jesus has made you a beloved child of God that is set apart to be loved by God and grace-filled and holy in this world. Now, Jesus does say that what comes out of your mouth can, but that's where Jesus comes in again, because on the cross he died for our forgiveness, and that forgiveness includes those times that what comes out of us makes us common. All of this is to say that Jesus lifts us up just as he was lifted up on the cross. We're lifted up in that death, but also in that life that he has, so that all of us are more than holy, right? We are God's beloved children, set apart, but set apart so that all can be gathered into God's grace and love. Which is why I love Martin Luther's explanation to the commandments in the catechisms. As he talks about them, he always provides sort of a better vision than just the don't do that. So don't use the Lord's name in vain. He says, yes, don't do that. But instead, live your whole life so that it can bring glory to God. That's the kind of thing that builds community and makes us more than common, right? Because Jesus has filled us with grace so that we can do all that we do to the glory of God. With the 8th commandment, he says, don't bear false witness against your neighbor. Instead, speak about them in the best possible light always and cover their dishonor with your honor. That's community building. That's taking the sense that we've been given this blessing so that we can share that blessing with others. When he talks about the 9th and 10th commandments, he says that not only should we not envy what our neighbor has in stuff and relationships, but we should work our best to protect what our neighbor has. Again, this is our blessing to be a blessing to others. So all of this is to say, as Jesus sits with these Pharisees who are getting picky about the rules and they're inspecting, he's saying, look, put down your inspection badges. Know that there is nothing that could make you unholy. He hasn't yet gotten to the cross as he's talking to them, but for us he has. He has gathered all of us up and said, you are God's beloved children. Start acting like it, right? Go out into the world and bless people with the blessings that you have been given so that all people might know this. That they might know that God has gathered them up. That Jesus loves them and nothing that we can do will God let us go. Amen.